Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes for folks to join. Thank you for being here today. Hi, everybody. Welcome again. Thank you for being here today. As we kick off the Cucumber Studio Introduction to Formulation webinar, I see some folks still popping in here, so we'll just give it another few seconds before we get started. I see some activity in the chat. That's great. Hi, everybody. Welcome from London. All right, let's get started. Again, thank you. Welcome to Cucumber Studio Introduction to Formulation webinar. My name is Alyssa Duval. I'm in product marketing here at SmartBear. I'm just going to go over a couple housekeeping items to start with. So this webinar session is being recorded. We'll send out the replay over the next couple of business days, so be on the lookout. If you have any questions during this webinar today, we ask that you just pop those into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible throughout, but if we're unable to get to them today, we'll make sure we follow up with you. And lastly, we will have a couple polls sprinkled throughout the presentation today. We'd appreciate if you took a few seconds just to answer those for us. It's super helpful in terms of getting to know who you are and to tailor content. So for future webinars, we can create content that serves your needs. So now I'd just like to go over a little bit about SmartBear. Can we just advance? There we go. Thank you. So just a little bit about SmartBear. SmartBear is a global company founded in 2009 with headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts, offices in 12 countries with more than 650 employees. We have more than 24,000 customers and 16 million users of our products. For more than a decade, SmartBear has been delivering high quality products and providing world-class customer support, trusted by companies like Google, Microsoft, Honda, Cisco, and more. We offer 14 different solutions across SDLC, including 3 very popular open source initiatives, including a popular API testing tool called SOAP UI open source, Cucumber, which is a software tool that supports behavior-driven development, or BDD, and the Open API initiative, also known as the Swagger API, which is for API design and documentation. So that's just a little bit about SmartBear. Today, we will have a couple presenters. I have already introduced myself, and I'm going to pass this over to Seb Rose and to Gasper Naj, who will walk you through today's webinar. So I will hand this off at this point and enjoy the presentation today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So actually for today we have prepared with a pretty short but hopefully quite straightforward agenda. So I guess if you are here and if you are listening to us, then probably you have heard about what behavior-driven development is. You have heard about probably the tool Cucumber, but now we would like to start the webinar by just having a kind of overview and a quick refresh about what we think about behavior-driven development with Seb. Afterwards, since the presentation is mainly about the formulation, that's our main topic, we will have a section where we would like to define what formulation means and what are the most important benefits of having such a separated activity. And then we would like to show how formulation works in practice. We would like to show you some principles that help you to make good or better scenarios. And basically, this will conclude our session today. And obviously, we will be happy to receive any questions for the end. And we will do our best to try to answer those. So that's our plan for today. And with that, I just give the word to Seb, who is going to start with the first topic.
Thanks, Gasper. So behavior-driven development has been historically quite hard to define, and the Cucumber organization and Gaspar and myself have really identified that there are three core practices of behavior-driven development, and we call them discovery, formulation, and automation. BDD builds on agile ways of working, so it's incremental, it's iterative, it's applied to one user story at a time, and we apply discovery, formulation, and automation in that order. And by the time you've written your automation code, then you're ready to develop some working software. I'm just going to dig in very quickly into the three practices. So discovery is an aspect of deliberate discovery. It's about learning and creating a shared understanding of the requirements. It's a collaborative activity, often conducted by people called the Three Amigos, a group called the Three Amigos. And one of the outputs from discovery that we expect and we hope for are concrete examples that illustrate the rules that need to be implemented. Formulation, we're going to be talking about a lot more today. And in formulation, we take those examples of system behavior that were created during discovery, and we formulate them as business readable documentation. And so we'll learn a lot more about that as we go through this webinar. Automation, we're not going to cover very much today. This is where we take those formulated examples, the scenarios that many of you might be familiar with, and we automate them so that we can drive out or guide the developers to develop the software that is required to satisfy the acceptance criteria. And it's time for our first poll, which is, what's your biggest barrier to adopting behavior-driven development? So Alyssa, if you could kick that up, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it might be sometimes hard to choose.
Yeah. I think the hardest thing to adopting behavior-driven development is how to spell behavior.
Yes. That's a very important one.
Very important. So it looks like we've kind of got most people have answered. We give you another few seconds just to sort of set the scene. There is also a technology or an approach to developing software known as acceptance test driven development, which is ATDD. ATDD and behavior-driven development are to all intents the same activity. Behavior-driven development was a term coined by Dan North in London in the UK, and acceptance test-driven development was coined by Ken Pugh and others in the US. So there's actually a US EU divide between BDD and ATDD quite often. So could you end that poll and share the results, please? So,
Sure thing.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. So it looks like a third of folk, or just over a third of folk, reckon the biggest barrier is lack of expertise. Next up is no consensus between business, dev, and test, which is always going to be a challenge. And then bringing up sort of third equal is difficulty writing acceptable scenarios and tight delivery deadlines. So that's really helpful for us. Thank you very much for that.
And hopefully for the lack of expertise, we can a little bit contribute today.
Well, indeed. Let's hope so. Okay, so let's talk about requirements. So the thing is that when we come to develop software, we really need to know what it is that we are going to develop. And quite a lot of agile teams that I've worked with over the past 2 decades, in fact, have really tried to use user stories as a substitute for requirements. And user stories were never intended to be requirements. And when a requirement comes along, when a story comes along, when someone starts working on a piece of story, there are always questions that we want to ask about that story, about that piece of functionality that we're supposed to develop. And these are typical questions that I've asked myself and people have asked me, because it's really hard to write good requirements, as people have discovered over not just the past couple of decades, but in fact over millennia. And one of the great ways of really challenging one's understanding of what you're being asked to do and to get clear answers is to say, give me an example. Because when someone gives you an example of how the system is supposed to behave, that gives you a very clear understanding of what is expected, and it allows you to probe edge cases and scenarios, cases that possibly haven't been covered yet. So we use a technique called example mapping to run this discovery space, to this discovery exercise. Example mapping is a technique that was discovered or invented by Matt Wynn a number of years ago. In the white box at the bottom right of the screen, there's a link through to his excellent blog article that introduces it in detail. And then there's a YouTube link to a live example of example mapping taking place. Essentially, Matt discovered or created example mapping using a pack of index cards of 4 colors. He used the yellow card to write down the name of the story that we're currently trying to understand. He used blue cards to capture the rules or business requirements or acceptance criteria that would govern the scope of that story. And then for each rule, he encouraged the team to explore their understanding of those rules, those requirements, by writing concrete examples on green cards that illustrated how that rule was supposed to behave. And if there was nobody in the 3Amigo meeting that could answer a question that somebody asked, then we captured it on a question card and answered it after the discovery session had finished. So here, with the previous slide, I said that a great way of demonstrating things was using examples. Example mapping is all about trying to illustrate rules using concrete examples. So let's take a concrete example of an example mapping session. In this case, the domain is a public lending library. The context or the story is that at the library, it's free to take out books that are on the shelves, but there's a charge of $1 if you want to reserve an item that's currently out on loan. So that means that when the book comes back into the library, they notify you and you can come in and borrow it next. So if we were to do example mapping, here's a very simplified example map, or the start of one. We have the story written on a yellow card, which says apply reservation charges to library members. And then we have a rule, which says members pay a reservation charge of $1. Now, this is quite often you'll have more than one acceptance criteria, more than one rule for each story. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we're just going to have a very, very simple story with a very restricted number of acceptance criteria. So the developers and testers are in the room. The 3Amigos session is up and running, and maybe we look at this story with this rule that defines its scope, and potentially a developer goes and writes out on a green card, Andrew reserves a book, he's charged $1. The product owner or business analyst is also in the room, and they look at this example, they go, yep, you've got that right. This is exactly the behavior that we're expecting. We have another person in the room, possibly someone with a test perspective, and they write a second example card. Andrew reserves 2 books. He is charged $1. The product owner takes a look at this and goes, that's not what I was expecting. What I intended was that he would be charged $2, $1 for each item that's being reserved. And then the tester probably will go say something like, well, this rule, members pay a reservation charge of $1, is not very clear. Let's refine that rule so that everybody really understands what's expected of us. It's in fact that members pay a reservation charge of $1 per item. Good point, says the product owner. Everyone wins here because now we've refined the rule, and there's not going to be any disagreements or misunderstandings when it comes to implementing and testing and deploying this rule. There's another person in the room, and they say, well, what happens if we want to reserve 200 books? Is that okay? And the product owner thinks for a minute and goes, well, that's a good question. I'm not sure how many books our system should allow somebody to reserve. So they take away a question, of is there a limit to the number of books that can be reserved? So in this very brief, very simplified example demonstration, we've seen a rule get refined, an example get corrected, and a question be captured to take away and get answered offline or asynchronously. Now, all of these are done with index cards. So that's how Matt invented it. That's how we used to teach it. That's what we hoped for, because we were looking for co-located teams with a war room that they could work in. That's not the world anymore, right? So even before the pandemic, teams were distributed. And now teams aren't just distributed, teams are all at home. So we hardly ever see anybody, right? So there's no way that we're going to be working on index cards with Sharpies and pushing them around on a table. There are many tools available that allow you to collaborate online synchronously. Ones that I found that have been very useful are tools like Google Docs. I know that Gaspar has been quite keen to use some Microsoft Online OneDrive type things using Excel. There's also MindMap and Miro, endless possibilities. However, the Cucumber Studio product that SmartBear produces has a built-in dedicated example mapping tool that allows for collaborative working on the example map, and it also has the domain knowledge built in, so you can move whole rules and columns of examples all at the same time, and all sorts of funky stuff. So I encourage you to check that out. So let's now dig into formulation. I'm going to hand over to Gaspar at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think, as you mentioned, the example mapping tool and the collaborative editing nature of that, that's the key essence of that, because these kind of meetings are not like that one person is talking and the others are just listening, but we are really working on those things all together. That's really great. So so basically formulation is the second practice that is happening usually after the discovery. And in our book with Seb, we try to define what formulation is, and we said that formulation is the process of turning a shared understanding of how the system should behave into a business readable specification. So that's what the formulation term means. But obviously you have used similar things already before. Some people call this specification. Some teams are calling this documentation. Some teams are just calling it writing the scenarios. What we decided to choose a separate word for that, or actually not only we, but together with the community, is to emphasize that when we are talking about formulation, then hopefully there was a discovery session happening before. So we have all agreed on what kind of examples are really essential to our understanding, what are the good information that helps us to understand the nature or correct the rules, as you have seen. But now our goal with the formulation is to turn that into some sort of written specification that can serve the team during the implementation phase, because it can be turned into automated tests, but it serves the team also long term, because probably the green index cards everyone remembers who were in the meeting in the next few weeks. But if you just come back to those green cards like a half year later, it will not be so clear what were the exact details that we have discussed there. And a formulated specification basically is better for that. So that's why this term formulation is a little bit separated from the discovery. Could you please go on to the next one? Thank you. So taking back the concrete example, so you have seen that we had a rule, and we had two examples. You see just the first example here. Andrew reserves a book. He's charged $1. As you remember, when we were in the meeting, it was all clear what we are talking about. But when we turn it into a formulated specification, and with Cucumber or SpecFlow or all the other Cucumber family tools, we are using a format called Gherkin, which is using the give and when and then keywords. Then basically this example has to be turned to that. Andrew reserves a book. You see on the right hand side, then we have a step like when he reserves one book. So that's a kind of one translation. That's all nice. He's charged $1. Then he's charged $1. That's all going very, very similar. However, as you see, we have introduced an additional given step, which is setting the stage, which is setting the context. Because when we were in the meeting, we were discussing the rule. Therefore, and since the rule is talking about members who are having these activities, so everyone was remembered that Andrew is a member in this library. But when we turn it into a long-living documentation, we have to state this explicitly, because otherwise this implicit knowledge or implicit information would be lost. And that's why this team has added this additional given step as well. And finally, our scenario, we call that like that, that was formulated from the example, looks like that. Given Andrew is a member, when he reserves 1 book, then he's charged $1. Yeah. And obviously, once we have the formulation for the first example, we can go on to the other examples and formulate those one as well. In this case, our 2 examples are very similar to each other. So obviously, formulating the second scenario wasn't a big challenge. But anyway, sometimes we have to do easy tasks as well. So in this case, we just did that quickly. The only change is that in this case, Andrew is reserving 2 books. He's charged $2 instead of 1. So that's basically how the process looks like, and how we are turning these examples into given when then based specification. Could you please go next? Thank you. The core elements of the BDD process and what we are turning the examples to are these, what we are calling scenarios. One scenario is basically one case that we are describing using the given when and then keywords. And formulation is primarily about how we can turn these examples into given when then based scenarios, but also how we are structuring and how we are composing some sort of large-scale living documentation out of these scenarios. Because obviously, if you just throw in hundreds of scenarios into a big bucket, then it would be very hard to find anything, and it would be very hard to get feedback from the team. And primarily, these scenarios with the tools like Cucumber or SpecFlow are put into so-called feature files. Probably many of you have seen them. These are the files with the extension feature, where all the scenarios that are belonging to rules that are related to that particular feature are basically put into one container. So if you are interested about the details of the library charges, you can open the library charges feature file, or to navigate to the library charges feature, and then you will see all the rules, all the acceptance criteria that we fulfilled or we are going to fulfill during the implementation of that. And one of that is the one that we discovered, the members pay reservation of $1 per item. And then we can collect all the scenarios related to that particular rule. And of course, we can have multiple rules and multiple scenarios in a feature file. So basically, feature file is some sort of container that we can use to have some primary grouping of the scenarios. So could you please go next? So in the scenarios that you have seen, they were pretty simple, right? So I think if you looked at the example and the scenario, they were almost identical. So we had to make really just a few modifications. However, if you are using this concept or using this practice in a real project, in a more complex project, then the thing is not always as easy as it was in our case. Sometimes the terms are not yet clear. Sometimes the phrasing style or setting the context statements needs a little bit more thinking, so over the years, basically the BDD practitioners or the teams who are practicing BDD and formulating scenarios have collected a set of golden rules, and these rules were that are making the scenarios better readable or generally better. And these rules were not really synchronized, so everyone had their own list of what they are focusing on. But I think there was a kind of consensus on what kind of things are really important to make a scenario better. And when we say better, that means that it should support more. It should support that we can get easily feedback from the stakeholders. It should support us to for maintainability in long term and many other things. And when we were working on the book with Seb, we were actually trying to collect these golden rules, these principles that the teams were using, and we're trying to somewhat consolidate them and revert them in a way that they should be easier to remember. And that's how we got the brief principles. So the brief principles are not our inventions, but basically we just rephrase them in a way that you can more easily remember. So brief is an acronym, and basically it is the initials of the first 5 principle, and actually briefness is the 6th one that we can focus on. So these are the 6 principles that you see here. The B stands for business readable. Actually, what we want to do, we'd like to draw the terminology from the business domain. We would like to express our scenarios using business language. The R stands for real data. Typically, at least in my experience, that's what usually the hardest to understand, because we software people are somewhat trained to state everything in a nice abstract and rule-like form. We have rules for that, so that's already existing, but the scenarios are not rules. They are concrete examples, and to make them concrete and to make them more clear, it's very useful to have some concrete data, some concrete real data inside, because they can better help for the understandability and just making sure that we have got the rule right. I stands for intention revealing. That's also very important because when you are thinking about what happens in the application or what is going to happen, then obviously there are many activities that the users or the other stakeholders will do. But we are not necessarily want to capture those in that low-level mechanical steps, but we are more interested in what the user's intention was, what they wanted to do. Because maybe today we have a solution for that, but maybe in the next version or somewhere later we will have a different solution. What kind of mechanical steps the user needs to do to be able to achieve the intention, but to keep these scenarios more stable and easier to maintain, phrasing the things in the intention revealing style. That's very important. The 4th one is the E. E stands for essential. Basically, all these scenarios are going to be executed and going to be going to verify the actual application. And obviously, to be able to verify the application, we need certain amount of data. We need certain amount of details. However, it looks like, and you can imagine, even to run a very simplistic scenario in an application, you need to have a lot of things ready for that. But when we are writing those down into a scenario, it's very important that we are really only keeping the essential details in the scenario and excluding all those irrelevant details or incidental details that are not supporting actually the expectation that we want to express. F stands for focused. We would like to have the scenarios structured or have the granularity of the scenarios in a way that they are always illustrating a single rule. You will see how that looks like. And at the end, having the scenarios brief is useful because short scenarios are simply easier to get feedback from. But in my experience, if you just try to follow the first 5 principles, then briefness is almost always just drops out for free. You don't have to work extra for that. So these are the 6 principles, a little bit of general description for each. But just like with BDD, the thing is how this looks like through an example. And for that, we thought that we will try to find an example, or we are finding an example where we can demonstrate these principles. And right now we have taken the approach to bring in a scenario which is not really a scenario. It's more like a test script. It's definitely not considered to be a good scenario. And what we are going to do, and definitely this is not the approach that you should do. So you shouldn't just write a bad scenario and then fix it, but you should do it immediately, right? But for us, this is very useful because through this bad scenario, we can basically show what are the consequences if you are if any of these principles are not really followed. And stay with us. We will show a fixed version as well at the end. So hopefully, after reviewing this scenario and after locating all those problems that are caused by not applying those principles, we will also provide a solution for that. So this is the scenario right now. I'm reading that up. Obviously, this is very painful, this scenario, but sometimes reading up any kind of scenario is useful, because if you are also listening to the scenario, I think it's easier to judge what kind of problems do we have with there. So given Andrew is a library member with membership number, and the long number comes here, and Lisa is a library staff with user ID staff-test-1, and Lisa has an authorization level C3, and loan book 1 is on loan and it's not overdue, and loan book 2 is out on loan and is overdue by 3 days. When she scans Andrew's membership card and she clicks on reserve books, and she enters loan book 1 in the text box with ID, and an ID comes here, and she clicks on search book button, and then loan book 1 should be displayed in the list box with the ID, and an ID comes here, and loan book 1 should have the status, and some cryptic number comes here. When she selects loan book 1 and clicks on reserve selected button, and she clicks on checkout button, then she should charge Andrew $1. So as you see, it's not really, probably you got lost in that, and that's absolutely fine. That's showing our point. So let's try to look at that, and let's try to see how the different principles apply to this particular test script. The first, the B, as you remember, probably it's for business readable. So I'm asking Seb now, because that's how our conversations usually look like. So what do you think, Seb? So is this business readable, and what does business readable means at all?
Yeah, so we can read it. You just read it out, but it's not just about being able to read it. It's about being able to interpret and understand it as well. So the challenge is, could you show it to your product owner or business analyst and get useful feedback from them about this scenario? Or are they going to look at this and go, it's all just techie detail and it's not the sort of thing that I'm interested in? And there's plenty of things that we could pull out here, but I've identified a couple, and it's the most important ones for me that stick out. This idea about having text box or list boxes with specific IDs. So we'll talk about why text boxes and list boxes possibly shouldn't be mentioned at all in this scenario. But the fact that we're saying what ID they should have, this is not something for the business to care about. This is definitely a level of implementation detail that is focused probably just for developers, maybe for testers as well, but certainly not for the business. On the other hand, there's this status of OL 17X. This also seems pretty unreadable to me. Now, I don't know, what do you think, Gaspar? Is OL 17X something that you think a product owner might know about?
Yeah, we don't know really the domain so deeply, but maybe they know, because maybe they are knowing the actual codes of them. But definitely, it's not something that immediately triggers something into their head. So they have to spend some time to think about that. Which one was that? Okay, maybe that was the one. And then so maybe they will understand that code, but definitely it takes more time, and probably that more time just removes the focus from the real meaning, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things in here that aren't business readable.
I agree.
So should we have a look at, but there's authorization level C3. That also, like OL 17X, that could be too confusing. I gave it a sort of amber light, because it may actually be just part of the domain terminology of this application. We don't know, because we don't have the context. But whenever you see these sort of technical details, you want to ask yourself, are these appropriate?
Yeah. So I think not.
Yeah.
Just my daughter is just coming in and disturbing me. Go away, please. So the next one is the R, which stands for real data, and so the question here is that what does real data look like, and what do we mean on real data here?
Well, so this idea of saying overdue by 3 days is real data, in the sense that we know that it's actually been overdue by 3 days rather than it's just overdue. So in many situations, people might write and loan book 2 is out on loan and is overdue. In this particular scenario, it might be unnecessary to say this, but in a scenario where you do have to talk about whether a book is overdue or not, it's probable that the number of days that it's overdue is important. Equally, at the end, we say Andrew should be charged $1 rather than Andrew should be charged. Well, here, this is specifically illustrating the rule that we care about, or the rule that we were discussing in the Three Amigos session, which is that Andrew should be charged $1 for every item that he reserves. So I think both of those seem straightforward and reasonable. Would you agree, Gaspar?
Yeah. As you said, maybe the overdue by 3 days is not necessarily important for this particular scenario, but generally such kind of statements are absolutely good. And even though that the application shouldn't only work if it's 3 day overdue, probably it should always work with 4 days overdue, but that's one concrete example. That's one concrete case that we're going to use to illustrate the rule.
Yeah. The text here that says loan book 1, so it's in quotes, which implies that it means something special. I have to say that if we're going to use real data, I would want to have the book title rather than something made up. I've never borrowed a book called Loan Book 1.
Me neither, and probably would never try.
No, exactly.
Doesn't sound very exciting, right?
No. So real data, use concrete data where you can, but only where it helps illustrate the rule that we're demonstrating using these examples.
The I stands for intention revealing, as you probably remember. So what does intention revealing means here, and what kind of intention is going to be revealed here in this scenario? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's a really long scenario, isn't it? And if you cast your mind back to the shorter scenario that we showed during the demo, it was all about Andrew reserving a book. And in fact, this whole section could just be replaced with when Andrew reserves one book. It is absolutely, that's all the intent is here. And all the detail is about, well, who clicks what where, who types what where, which buttons are pressed. These are all important things for the implementation, but the specific rule that we're trying to focus on is about reserving a book, and to reveal the intention, that's all you need to say.
Yeah, that's right. So by the way, this intention revealing problem very often also happens with the given step. So when you need to have a lot of mechanical steps to be able to achieve one kind of initial statement, and focusing on that and trying to understand what we really needed to have this as a starting point for this scenario, that also makes this scenario much more readable and much more useful. Yeah, let's go next. So E stands for essential. So we are talking about details, but what do you think? Is this all information here essential that we see here?
I think we've already implied that it's not. So there's a whole bundle of stuff that is inessential. So given Andrew is a library member, we know that is essential, but the membership number makes no difference. His membership number could be ABC, and we wouldn't mind. Lisa being the library staff, well, if we do need to mention Lisa in this scenario, then it might be important to say what role she has, but what her user ID is, no, I don't think that's essential. That's stuff that might need to be catered for in the automation code. Great, we need to manage the automation that sets up this data, but we don't need to pollute our scenarios with this inessential detail. We've been told that loan book 1 is out on loan and is not overdue. Well, there's nothing in our rule that talks about whether the different behaviors if a book is overdue or not. And therefore, being overdue is inessential information. It may be necessary in another scenario, illustrating a different rule, but it's not essential here. Finally, oops.
Yeah, loan book 2 itself is not even necessary.
Yeah, right enough. So we're not using loan book 2
at all. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So we are the letter F, which is about focus. So what is this really focused on? This scenario.
Yeah, good question. Well, so we already talked about it. It's focused on the fact that Andrew should be charged $1 when he reserves one book. So it's really good that we have a single then down here that talks about Andrew being charged $1. However, we've got previously in this scenario a couple of other thens, or a then and an and, that talk about things that have nothing to do with the rule that we were supposed to be focusing on. And therefore, these are quite clearly not necessary. And by having them here, it means that this is not a focus scenario.
Exactly. Maybe there will be another scenario where this is an important expected outcome, but not in this one. Usually this focused rule or focus principle could be validated by looking at the then steps. Especially if you have multiple then steps, you always have to verify whether all those then steps are really supporting that particular rule that you are explaining, and not belonging to different rules. That's altogether makes this scenario much harder to maintain. Oh, that's great. So we had the F, and then finally we have the brief S, which is also a principle. Well, it would be stupid to ask whether this is brief or not. I think it's clear to everyone that it's not brief. But what do you think? Why is this briefness useful, or can this be always achieved?
So if you're illustrating a single rule for a single behavior, I believe it can always be achieved. And by keeping scenarios brief, it means that they're easy to read, they're easy to reason about, and they're cheaper to maintain. So in general, the heuristic that we showed on the original brief slide said 5 lines or fewer. And I typically find that 5 lines or fewer is a useful heuristic to apply when writing a scenario. If it goes over 5 lines, you need to ask yourself why.
Yeah, that's very important. Good. So actually we went through the 6 principles. So probably you have seen what kind of problems are caused by not applying those principles on a particular scenario. So let's think about how then a better scenario from the same for the same story or the same example would look like. And let's just give everyone like a 10 seconds so you can think it over. What would be the scenario in your head that would be business readable, that would use maybe some real data, that would focus on the intention, only keep essential details, and focusing on that particular rule that you see here. So let's have 10 seconds of silence, and then we will show our own version.
And specifically, we're talking about a scenario that demonstrates a library member reserving a book that illustrates the rule that members pay reservation of $1 per item.
Yeah. I think it was like 10 seconds, so maybe we can just
let's go for it.
Yeah.
So what we came up with is, given Andrew is a library member and War and Peace is out on loan, when he reserves War and Peace, then he should be charged $1. So it's very similar to the scenario that we showed right at the beginning. We've got an extra piece of context because, in fact, it is important that the book is out on loan, because it's not possible to reserve a book that's currently on the shelf. You need to go and pull it off the shelf yourself. So I don't know how this compares to yours. Be interested to hear from you in on social media, or send us an email after the session.
Or maybe in the Q&A session, if you have some particular question to that, we can also answer. If I'm just looking at this scenario, maybe the only thing that I would change, maybe I would change the War and Peace to something like Harry Potter 8 or whatever, some more popular book. Because imagining that you are running out of War and Peace, whatever. That's the thing.
Your daughter's getting to you.
Yeah.
So the takeaways that we'd like to leave you with are that BDD is collaborative. So discovery is collaborative, formulation is collaborative. We need to all have a shared understanding, and the formulated scenarios need to make sense to everybody on the team, both today and in the future. It's concrete examples that help build that shared understanding. So this is what we do during example mapping. And we believe that documentation must adhere to, or at least be aware of, the brief principles, because otherwise no one's going to read it, and it will soon decay and rot. And by contrast, BDD is not a technical activity. It's a collaborative activity that requires the participation of the three amigos, so specifically a representative from the customer, representative from the development community, and a representative of the QA or test community. Collaboration through discovery is not optional. So if all you want to do is write test scripts using Gherkin and have them run by Cucumber, that's fine, but it won't be behavior-driven development. We need collaborative discovery to get the benefit of the behavior-driven development approach to software development. And finally, if you don't follow brief principles, then your documentation is more than likely to be unreadable, and unreadable documentation is not useful.
It's a waste of effort.
So, Alyssa, could you fling up the second poll, please? Where do you author your scenarios? And we'll give this sort of 10, 15 seconds to go, and then and while you're doing that, I'm going to start looking through the Q&A. And then we will, once it stops growing, we will share the poll and start answering some questions. Okay, thank you. Could you share the poll, please, Alyssa? Right, so this is really very interesting information. So I'm not surprised that so many people author their scenarios in an issue tracker such as Jira. I'm kind of surprised so many people author them in Eclipse. So that's something that we'll take away as an interesting piece of information.
I think they mean that you're writing the Gherkin file in your IDE.
Yes.
Basically, writing it directly to Cucumber.
Exactly. It seems just it may be a difficult place to collaborate with people.
Yeah.
Non-technical folk. Okay, so thank you very much for that. And let's now move on to some Q&A. Gaspar, have you picked out a question that you would like to answer?
I haven't yet, but let's have a quick look.
Okay, so...
But if you have one, just go ahead.
Yeah, so Dennis asks, reserving multiple books should contain the step that Andrew doesn't have any reservations as well. So that's an interesting point. So the comment that Dennis is saying is, well, potentially, if Dennis doesn't have any books reserved already, if Dennis does have some books reserved already, there may be a different rule that applies. And I don't agree with you, Dennis. I mean, we don't know enough about the domain because we didn't go into details, but the rule that we were trying to illustrate was that Andrew should be charged $1 for every item he reserves. And there was no rule, or at least we haven't seen the rule that says that there's a maximum number of books to reserve, or that that there have been no books reserved already, or even that book hasn't been reserved by somebody else. These are all potentially valid rules, but that's not the rule that we were trying to illustrate. The rule that we were illustrating was that if he reserves a book, then he will be charged $1.
But I think these questions that are all related to the library domain are very important, because this is showing how this example mapping is working. So once you see an example, a lot of this is what if questions coming up. And if these questions are coming up before you start implementing the code, that's a super benefit, because these questions would anyway come up sooner or later, and it's better to answer them and clear them out earlier than later. So my one that I have picked is from Lynn. can BDD be combined with data-driven and how? And I think it's also a very, very good question. So generally, as you see, or as you have seen probably from the presentation, so when we do BDD, we are trying to understand the problem and document the problem in a way that we can fulfill the expectations. In many cases, the problem is like describing the workflow, the business workflow, the user workflow, and for that, the classic way or kind of the scenarios that you have seen are probably good. Sometimes the requirement is about what kind of input variations are providing what kind of output. So maybe if there would be a whatever shipping cost charges, then depending on the location, depending on the country, whatever else, the number of books that you want to ship, there is an expected shipping cost. Of course, for those cases, having individual green card for every variation of data would be somehow not very convenient, because you would have a lot of similar card, just a little bit of data variation in there. What you would do if you would be at the end next to a whiteboard, you would sketch up a quick, simple table with the different variation, different input-output pairs. And actually, if that's the expectation, if that's how it is the easiest to describe how you want to have that particular behavior to behave, then that's the right thing to do. And actually, with the Gherkin syntax, there is something called scenario outline, where basically you can preserve that data variation examples table and basically rerun the same scenario with those different data variation as well. So that's perfectly documentable with BDD and Gherkin. The only thing that you have to be careful that BDD is primarily not for full coverage testing, where finding out all the edge cases and all the variations, but because simply that would be not business readable at the end. Probably for that, it's better to use some sort of unit testing or low-level test, technical programmer test platform. Probably those edge case tests are much faster that way anyway. But what BDD is about, to get a good overview, and for that good overview, having some well illustrative data rows is absolutely fine, and you can do that with scenario outlines.
Rajendra has asked, how do we string together multiple scenarios, which is generally the need to perform end-to-end testing, system integration testing? And the simple answer is you don't. And in fact, Cucumber has been built specifically to try and ensure that every scenario is isolated from every other scenario, i.e. you should be able to run your scenarios in any order you want. So there's a number of things that we could unwrap from what Rajendra has asked. But the first point is that we're here talking about using Cucumber as a way to automate at the end of a behavior-driven development process. And behavior-driven development, although it generates automated tests that give you confidence to release, that's not its purpose. So the focused illustrative scenarios that we're talking about today are about demonstrating that specific small fine granularity behaviors, work as intended. The sort of long-running use case or journey type use of the system that Rajendra is referring to here when he's talking about end-to-end or system integration testing, we haven't demonstrated those today, but they would be a single scenario. In our book Formulation, we call these journey scenarios. We believe that you need very few of them, or at least you should strive to need very few of them, because the sort of end-to-end scenario like that can be very slow to run, it can be very brittle, and when it does go wrong, it can be very hard to debug because there's so many bits that are being used as you run through a whole user journey. So we follow the test automation pyramid approach, where the foundation of our automation strategy is small, fast tests that focus on a single behavior or single component's behavior, rather than end-to-end testing. As I said earlier, you're well within, Cucumber is very happy to run very long scenarios if you like, but it will definitely not allow you, or it will do its best to stop you from allowing the results of one scenario to bleed into another, and that's by intention.
Yep. That's great. I have picked one from Marco. He was saying that that to get rid of the details, we have to implement these details in the step definition, so pushing it down to the step definition. And his question was that, would you write a specific step definition just for one scenario? And I like this question very much because that's a question that pops up very quickly, especially related to the essential details. So if you only keep the essential details in the scenario, that means that all the incidental details are also necessary. So if you are just simulating logging in with the user, you need a username and a password. We just don't want to show it in the scenario. So the details are necessary, but we are pushing them down to the automation layer. And that means, or that can mean, that that we are just creating different variations of the steps, and that would mean that that we need to make different variations of step definitions that are just used in that particular scenario. In Cucumber, you can reuse the existing step definition. So once you made an automation for a step, then you can reuse that in another scenario, which is great, and I think that's a great feature of Cucumber. On the other hand, what I think both Seb and I are fully agreeing on that what we realize that if you are focusing on reusability, then it just locks your mind into the wrong way. So just worrying about whether this thing is going to be reused is somehow will turn the scenarios that you are making into some complex, unreadable scenarios with a lot of details. And at the end, you will not win too much with the reusability because no one will actually willing to use your scenarios at the end. And it will be, and then you just moved the complexity just one level up. On the other hand, what I like to do is that I like to don't worry about reusability. Let's forget about that for a moment. Let's rather worry about whether your language is consistent. Is this the style how we are usually phrasing out like that? Is this fitting to the other scenarios? Are we using the same grammar structures? And you are answering with yes for all of these questions. And it happens that right now you are not yet reusing that particular step. That is all fine. Anyway, inside the implementation in the automation infrastructure, you can have also multiple layers. So just because you have two step definitions talking about similar things with different level of details, it doesn't mean that you need to copy paste the automation logic. You can just push it down into a lower automation layer, driver layer, and basically with that your step definition will be very small and very thin. They are really only be doing what they are only be doing is that they are translating the English sentence to some automation activities, and therefore having the cost of one more step definition is not as high. And you will see if you follow the consistency, it can happen that later on there will be another scenario which will be benefit from the same step definition. It's very hard to predict that, and too much focusing on that is just going you to bringing you to the wrong way.
I'm cheating. I've actually selected two to answer, so I'm going to do one quickly, which is from Florentina, who asks, how does TDD fit into BDD? So you will find on a number of blogs and articles around the place a diagram that shows how it fits in. BDD is an outer loop, and when you've gone through discovery and formulation and automation of the scenarios, then you drop into an inner loop of TDD. And once that scenario is passing, you pop out of that inner loop of TDD and pick the next scenario to formulate and automate. So it's a two-level loop. BDD is the outer loop, which drives larger pieces of behavior, and TDD is the inner loop, which drives the design of the actual implementation of the code. And there's a question from Andrew Smith, which is one that comes up a lot. He says that if your given has a lot of dependencies, how do you keep a scenario brief? You know, like if you were to say, given there's a library and it has books and one book is and this is a great question. Gaspar hinted at it as we were going through the slide deck. The truth is that what we're looking for isn't to talk about all the dependencies, but just the dependencies that are essential to illustrate the rule that we are focusing on. And most of those dependencies will disappear. That's not to say they don't need to be catered for in the automation layer. They absolutely will. There are many patterns and techniques that can help you do this in the automation layer. For instance, a builder object, which comes up with useful defaults, and you only then specify in your scenario the essential deviation from the defaults. Equally, If you really do have a specific complex scenario, then you give it a named scenario. So you use a data persona to describe that setup, and you pull something from the business domain. If you can't concisely talk about a list of dependencies that are essential, then it's probable that you're missing some domain abstraction. There's a wonderful article by Dan North. I can't remember the name of it at the moment, but it does talk about knowing your abstraction, because if you really understand your domain, then typically the cases that you want to illustrate in examples will have a concise way of being described, because you have to think about why these situations occur. They are specific. There are specific situations, specific edge cases that are being covered.
I think it's whose domain is it anyway, or
thank you. That's exactly it. Whose domain is it anyway?
Okay, I think we are running out of time, so I think
we are at time. So thank you very much, folks, for coming along. As Lisa said, we will take the unanswered questions away and write up answers for them and send them out with the communication that also sends you the link to the recording.
And probably the slides.
And the slides.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.